The gaslights of London's Metropolitan Tabernacle caught the sweat on Charles Spurgeon's brow as his booming, melodic voice captivated over 5,000 souls, weaving wit and gospel assurance masterfully. He wove those elements so masterfully that he seemed entirely untouchable to the massive crowd gathered inside the building, yet hours later that very same voice would be completely reduced. His booming voice would be reduced to a fragile whisper, and that brilliant mind would lock Charles Spurgeon in a dark room, weeping for days over a sorrow he could not explain. This was a deep, agonizing sorrow that the preacher could neither explain nor escape during his private hours away from the bright, welcoming gaslights of the great metropolitan pulpit. Long before the modern world began to tentatively dismantle the stigma surrounding mental health, Victorian London's greatest pulpit phenomenon, Charles Spurgeon, was quietly drowning in the deep abyss of trauma. He was drowning in the deep abyss of what clinicians today would recognize as severe PTSD and major clinical depression built up from years of intense relational and physical trauma. Charles Spurgeon comforted millions with his sermons, yet he frequently identified with Job's raw cry for death over life, proving that spiritual greatness and emotional fracturing are not separate. His internal torment proved that spiritual greatness and emotional fracturing are not mutually exclusive, but are sometimes deeply, inextricably linked together through the complex realities of human psychological suffering. The historical legacy of Charles Haddon Spurgeon is typically painted in the most brilliant triumphalist colors by modern observers who look back at 19th century church history with admiration. To the casual observer of 19th century church history, Charles Spurgeon remains the peerless prince of preachers, a Victorian titan whose rhetorical genius, theological clarity, and organizational acumen revolutionized Britain. At the Metropolitan Tabernacle in London, Charles Spurgeon addressed thousands weekly, his voice carrying the gospel with an energetic, magnetic vitality that seemed entirely devoid of hesitation or weakness. Yet, this dazzling public ministry existed in a perpetual, agonizing tension with an undercover reality. Behind the booming cadences of the metropolitan pulpit lay Charles Spurgeon, intimately acquainted with darkness. Behind that public facade lay a man who was intimately acquainted with the darkest corridors of human depression throughout the entire duration of his landmark 19th century pastoral ministry. To understand the magnitude of Spurgeon's internal conflict, one must first look at the stark divergence between his outward presence and his inward reality. Publicly, Spurgeon was a force of total nature. His sermons were laced with a sharp, sanctified humor, an accessible colloquial style, and a relentless focus on the joy of the Christian gospel delivered with true passion. He did not project the image of a sterile, detached academic. Instead, Charles Spurgeon radiated warmth, confidence, and a lively assurance that captivated believers and skeptics alike completely. However, when the gaslights of the tabernacle were extinguished and the crowds dispersed, a completely different narrative unfolded for the famous preacher during his hidden, quiet hours. Spurgeon wrestled with a paralyzing chronic depression throughout the entirety of his adult life. This was not a minor case of periodic moodiness or the occasional simple blues. This was a devastating systemic vulnerability that periodically brought his world to a grinding halt. The inner torment was so pronounced that it frequently crossed severe, painful boundaries. His internal sorrow crossed the boundary from psychological distress into total physical and vocational incapacitation, making it completely impossible for him to fulfill his standard duties at times. The roots of this suffering were complex and multi-layered, driven by a compounding convergence of bodily decay and emotional weight that heavily pressured the great preacher's mind. From the year 1867 onward, Spurgeon's physical frame became a battleground. He began to endure the excruciating, fiery torments of rheumatic gout, a condition causing intense agony. This condition not only caused intense physical agony, but also structurally altered his ability to function. This physical affliction likewise arrived with increasingly acute kidney and liver malfunctions. These progressive illnesses drained his systemic vitality. The constant nagging presence of physical illness operated as a biological amplifier for Charles Spurgeon's severe and dark mental distress. His condition created a feedback loop where physical pain triggered emotional despondency, and this intense emotional despondency further weakened his fragile health over many long, agonizing seasons. The severity of these combined physical and psychological assaults was so immense that it deeply alarmed his closest companions who watched his life unfold from a front row seat. His beloved wife, Susanna, who watched him navigate these dark nights of the soul, was occasionally gripped by the terrifying realization that her husband might never recover his stability. There were seasons of such profound collapse that Susanna genuinely questioned whether Charles Spurgeon would ever possess the stamina, clarity, or will to step back into the pulpit. Thus, the man who comforted millions spent a significant portion of his life on the brink of total collapse, proving his legendary endurance was sustained strictly by divine grace. Charles Spurgeon's mental anguish was not a spiritual vacuum or a theological defect, but the inevitable fallout of a brutal convergence of physiological, psychological, relational, and vocational crises. The primary engine behind Spurgeon's darkness was a systematically failing body. He suffered from severe hereditary gout and Bright's disease, which is a chronic kidney inflammation. Beginning in 1867, attacks of rheumatic gout regularly crippled him, growing progressively more frequent and acute until his death in 1892 after years of unremitting bodily suffering. This physical breakdown directly drove his emotional collapses. The toxins accumulating in his blood altered his brain chemistry, making systemic gloom an inescapable biological accompaniment to his immense physical pain. In October 1856, during a service where the 22-year-old Spurgeon was preaching to over 10,000 people, malicious pranksters suddenly shouted, "Fire!" inside the crowded auditorium. The resulting panic killed 8 people and severely injured dozens of attendees. This intense trauma left Spurgeon with chronic insomnia, nightmares, and a lifetime of severe PTSD. The disaster permanently altered his mind, leaving Charles Spurgeon with a hyper-reactive nervous system that was continuously prone to absolute despair during his quiet, private hours. Spurgeon's domestic life offered no refuge. His wife, Susanna, suffered from agonizing gynecological complications that left her a semi-invalid following surgery in the late 1860s. Watching his soulmate live in perpetual debilitating pain heavily depleted Spurgeon's remaining psychological reserves as he balanced his massive public ministry with heavy domestic sorrow. External pressures added a final, crushing layer. Spurgeon engaged in fierce theological battles against modernism, culminating in his heartbreaking resignation from the Baptist Union during the 1887 downgrade controversy. This isolation was compounded by a lifetime of merciless public mockery from secular newspapers and rival churchmen who lampooned his preaching style, occasionally leaving his heart well-nigh broken. Spurgeon possessed a deeply introspective, highly sensitive, and empathetic personality. While this fueled his ministry, it also made him vulnerable to profound despondency when high ideals collapsed. He saw his high ideals collide with messy realities. He weaponized this intense focus through relentless overwork. Spending long, isolated hours in study, he routinely violated Sabbath rest. By constantly burning through his psychological and spiritual energy without restorative downtime, Charles Spurgeon systematically bankrupted his own defenses against the onslaught of clinical melancholy. The depth of Spurgeon's melancholy was not abstract internal moodiness, but a severe, concrete reality that regularly crippled his daily existence with immense clinical intensity. The clinical intensity of these episodes highlights how his psychological battles were fundamentally distinct from ordinary spiritual doubt experienced by common individuals during difficult seasons. By contemporary psychiatric metrics, Spurgeon's condition would warrant a diagnosis of major clinical depression due to its immense severity and lingering long-term impact. Despite his responsibility of preaching to thousands weekly at the Metropolitan Tabernacle, the weight of his despondency frequently overrode his formidable willpower entirely. His first total collapse occurred in October 1858. After he was forced away from his pulpit for 3 consecutive Sundays, Spurgeon addressed his flock. He openly recounted to his congregation that his spirits had sunk so low that he could weep by the hour like a child, completely unaware of. He was completely unaware of the cause. This systemic heaviness became a recurring theme. Operative in tandem with his physical ailments, long and dark stretches occurred. Stretches occurred where the Prince of Preachers could not bear the sight of a human face, remaining confined to his bed for weeks as sorrow hijacked him. The sorrow hijacked his mind. The psychological torment occasionally intensified to active, terrifying suicidal ideation. Charles Spurgeon did not sanitize his deep internal pain. He explicitly confessed that his internal agonies were so sharp that he fully sympathized with Job's cry, preferring death over a miserable and broken existence. In moments of unvarnished honesty, Charles Spurgeon admitted that the mental darkness could become so overwhelming that he felt he could have laid violent hands upon himself. He felt he could have done this simply to escape the misery. During these dips into the abyss, a suffocating despair led him to conclude he should not exist. A suffocating despair led him to conclude that it would have been better had he never been born to endure such unremitting, painful internal agonies. Spurgeon maintained a sophisticated distinction between standard mental struggle and what he categorized as uniquely spiritual darkness that targeted his core inner identity. While he recognized that his mind was subject to human psychological frailties, separate targeted assaults specifically afflicted his soul over many long and dark seasons. This spiritual darkness was characterized by a profound, agonizing despair regarding his personal salvation. During these eclipses, the very theological truths he masterfully preached seemed closed. The truths preached to millions seemed entirely closed off. He felt utterly abandoned by God, cast away as a hypocrite, and left lonely in a wasteland. He was left where assurance of grace was obscured. His suffering was a complex tapestry, one thread woven from broken chemistry and the other from existential wrestling. One thread was woven from the broken chemistry of his body, and the other from a deep existential wrestling with the hiddenness of God Almighty. Charles Spurgeon did not persevere by discovering a magical cure, but by viewing his melancholy through a completely different, deeply spiritual lens and perspective. Rather than treating psychological brokenness as an embarrassing liability, he allowed it to reshape his pastoral identity, transforming personal agony into a powerful tool for ministry. Initially, Spurgeon viewed his psychological descents with harsh self-judgment, labeling despondency a vice and feeling heartily ashamed of his deep, dark internal struggles. However, as the waves of melancholy persisted, he discarded the armor of pastoral perfection and leaned directly into radical vulnerability before his massive congregation.
The strong man is sometimes very weak. I have myself suffered times of great depression.
By exposing his wounds, Charles Spurgeon disarmed the toxic stigma surrounding mental illness in the church for generations of faithful believers who suffered in silence. Through the fog of despair, Spurgeon formulated a robust theology of sanctified affliction, rejecting the notion that suffering signaled divine displeasure or loss of grace. He believed these emotional winters drew believers into a desperate closeness with Christ. His theological framework rested completely and securely upon 3 distinct foundational pillars. The first pillar was the sovereign care of God. Affliction was purposefully governed by a loving Creator who directed all things according to his absolute wisdom. The second pillar was fellowship with Christ. True communion was deepened by entering the fellowship of Christ's sufferings during dark nights of the human soul. The third pillar was greater usefulness. Brokenness was the primary mechanism qualifying a leader to heal others who were navigating their own deep valleys. This theological reorientation altered how Spurgeon defined a pastor. In his famous Pastor's College lecture, The Minister's Fainting Fits, he normalized clinical melancholy openly. He normalized clinical melancholy for the next generation of leaders. He instructed them never to view seasons of darkness as ministerial failure or spiritual defeat. He told them to view darkness as predictable occupational realities of spiritual warfare. True gospel labor, he warned, naturally demanded an emotional output that was immense. True gospel labor demanded an output that would inevitably break mere mortals who attempted to carry the crushing burdens of ministry in their own strength. Ultimately, Spurgeon's preaching became the primary beneficiary of his agony. Realizing his descents equipped him to speak with unsimulated authority, he reflected on his journey.
I would go into the deeps 100 times to cheer a downcast spirit.
Because he spoke from the honest depths of his own psychological brokenness, his voice possessed a raw empathy that resonated deeply with an industrial London working class. He spoke directly to a working class well acquainted with poverty, disease, and death. He spoke not from detached ease, but as a fellow sufferer in the trenches. The extensive network of London institutions Spurgeon constructed was not a byproduct of an unblemished career. It was directly informed by his personal acquaintance with vulnerability. His familiarity with pain served as the architectural blueprint for his legacy. In 1856, Spurgeon founded the Pastor's College to train working-class ministers for service. Knowing the terrifying psychological toll of pastoral isolation, he structured the college to be an intensely communal, supportive environment designed to uplift every single student. Working with generations of these empathetic students, Spurgeon orchestrated an aggressive church planting strategy that redrew the religious map of Great Britain during the 19th century. He deliberately multiplied a new breed of pastors trained to step directly into the emotional trenches of destitute, overcrowded sectors of London to offer real hope. Spurgeon's personal experience with helplessness birthed a profound social conscience, culminating in the opening of the Stockwell Orphanage in 1869 to protect the young and vulnerable. Recognizing that Victorian illness or death cast families into absolute destitution, the orphanage provided holistic care for vulnerable children who had lost their primary support. This venture, along with dozens of Tabernacle benevolent societies, was funded by a vast network of global supporters and local working class members who gave regularly. Spurgeon leveraged his massive global media platform to channel wealth directly into institutional care for the hurting who were suffering across the crowded city of London. Theologically, Spurgeon operated as an evangelical Calvinist. His paradoxical framework married a fierce commitment to God's absolute sovereignty with deeply passionate, accessible evangelistic preaching to all. Anchored in covenant theology and Puritan works, his worldview was also colored by 19th century giants like J. Hudson Taylor and George Muller, who walked by faith. These men relied strictly on faith and prayer for funding. Yet Charles Spurgeon also admired Samuel Smiles' Self-Help, published in 1859 during his ministry. He admired that work, creating a matrix where strict reliance on divine grace intersected with a rugged Victorian work ethic to guide his daily operations completely. This unique blend provided the stamina required to weather the isolation of his intense doctrinal defenses against modernism throughout the later years of his life. History often views Spurgeon exclusively as an oratorical phenomenon, missing his immense administrative wisdom in governing a local assembly of over 5,000 members safely. His leadership style was forged in his own weakness. Knowing how easily a flock scatters when a leader is struck down, he built robust networks of support. He built networks of elders, deacons, and visitation teams. This ensured the church remained a highly functional mutual care community, even when he was completely incapacitated by darkness. The ultimate value of Charles Spurgeon's biography is found not in how he avoided breaking, but in how he endured and pushed forward while deeply broken. How did this man find the strength to continuously persevere and preach through such unremitting, compounded adversity? His answer lay in an intentional execution of specific strategies of grace. Despite enduring a lifetime of devastating physical torments, vicious public slanders, and paralyzing emotional collapses, Spurgeon stubbornly resisted the temptation to quit his calling. He resolutely endured to the very end, remaining miraculously empowered to preach with staggering clarity until his final sermon at the Metropolitan Tabernacle on June 7, 1891. His long-term survival provides a historical roadmap, proving that true Christian perseverance is defined not by the absence of struggle, but by a gritty, enduring faithfulness. True faithfulness is maintained directly through its center. Navigating and surviving deep emotional despondency strips external adversity of its lethal ministry-killing power completely. Spurgeon's life was a masterclass in utilizing divine and practical lifelines. Understanding that a shattered mind cannot be repaired by mere platitudes, he implemented highly specific safeguards. He implemented safeguards to preserve his sanity. When London's damp winter fog threatened his lungs and intensified his gout, he retreated to Menton, France, for months at a time. In the warm Mediterranean climate, he forced his body to rest and disengage from the relentless pressures of the Tabernacle ministry and heavy weekly schedule. When his thoughts became a chaotic whirl of depression, he submerged his mind in the deep thoughts of the past, sitting for hours alone reading the Puritans. He read the Puritans to anchor his unstable emotions. His ultimate survival strategy was an unconditional surrender to a sovereign, intensely caring God who ruled over all. When he could not trace God's hand through the blinding fog of depression, he chose simply and completely to trust his heart and perfect character. On January 31st, 1892, while resting in Menton, France, Charles Haddon Spurgeon finally escaped his earthly suffering and entered his eternal reward. The physical frame racked by gout and the brilliant mind assaulted by clinical melancholy were finally granted a permanent Sabbath from their long historic labors. Spurgeon's legacy remains a vital monument for contemporary leadership. By discarding the mask of pastoral perfection and looking his depression in the face, he provided a permanent gift. He provided a validating gift to generations of believers. His life continues to offer unshakable proof that a soul can be broken, acquainted with despair, and yet remain powerfully used by God. The paradox of Charles Spurgeon's life forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that profound faith and deep emotional fracture can coexist in the same soul. We often demand that our leaders and heroes project an image of unblemished strength, forgetting that God's power is historically made perfect in profound human weakness. If the Prince of Preachers could occupy the highest heights of success while navigating the absolute abyss of clinical despair, we must dismantle the toxic assumption that mental illness is a sign of spiritual failure. Your darkest valleys do not disqualify you from grace. Rather, like Spurgeon, they may be the very terrain where your deepest empathy and purpose are forged. Are you treating your own mental and emotional battles as an embarrassing spiritual defect to be hidden? Or are you willing to allow your wounds to become the soil for an authentic ministry? How can our faith communities shift from offering sterile, sanitized platitudes to creating safe, vulnerable spaces where the brokenness of faithful believers is actively embraced? Join us next week as we dive into the life of Frances Ridley Havergal, the invalid hymn writer. We will explore the story of a woman who, despite chronic physical frailty, penned some of the church's most enduring, joyful hymns of absolute surrender and praise. If this deep dive into the hidden battles of church history resonated with you, please subscribe to Theology Today here. Hit the notification bell, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to know that it is entirely okay to be a broken vessel in the hands of a sovereign God.